Welcome back to the SAS Connect Online. I'm Cory Snyder with Maropost, and I have the pleasure of having Bob Moore on the line, where we're going to talk with Crossbeam. We're going to go over some really interesting and cool information today, specifically raising 76 million for partnership tech, kind of how it happened, and what we learned, specifically what you learned, Bob. So, some of you probably know Bob. Bob's been in the partnership industry for a very long time with Crossbeam, but a little bit more about Bob and who he is. So he's a co-founder and CEO of Crossbeam, a collaborative database platform. Just to add some additional context here, I'm going to flash my shirt for you. Here, Bob, representing Crossbeam today. That helps companies build more valuable partnerships by discovering which customers and leads they have in common. We currently use Crossbeam at Maropost. We love it. We recommend it to all of our partners and those we interact with. But more, Bob also previously co-founded Stitch, which was acquired by Talent back in 2018, and RJ Metrics, acquired by Adobe by way of Magento Commerce in 2006. Bob's been writing about technology startups and data, has appeared in New York Times, Forbes, TechCrunch, VentureBeat, and numerous other publications. And we couldn't be more excited to have Bob on. Some other side stuff, outside his day job of Crossbeam and obviously everything else that Bob does. Moore has served as board chair of Philly Startup Leaders Improv Comedy Performer. We'll have to test that today at Philly Improv Theater, and trustee of the Glassboro Education Foundation, which is awesome. So everybody, welcome Bob Moore with Crossbeam today, and we'll get jumped in. But Bob, anything you'd like to add specifically?
I'm just terrified by how far up you just set that bar with that exhaustive exploration of my LinkedIn profile. Super happy to be here. Huge fan of CSA. I'm pumped for SAS Connect in April. I'm definitely planning to be there, and hopefully we'll all get to exchange some hygienic high fives out at that event soon. But yeah, this I'm really thrilled to see how many people we've got attending and curious about this subject, because near and dear to my heart is making sure that companies that are trying to do good stuff in the partnership space are well funded, and that not only that, there's just a great sense of momentum behind the space in general. And I think one of the weird side effects of raising capital is that it is a magnet for everything that it develops a sense of momentum, whether it's attracting amazing talent or press attention or frankly buyers and budget and things like that. So anyway, yeah, lots to dig in here, and really appreciate you taking the lead on hosting us, Cory.
Yeah, of course. I'm super excited. Obviously, I've experienced going through rounds of funding as well. So love the perspective that you're going to be able to provide today. And we're going to jump into a lot of different topics. So we're going to talk about why raise money at all. We're going to talk about the VC market as far as it's warming up, and not only warming up as we've seen over the last 2 years, but warming up to partnerships and channel platforms, and just partnerships and channel as a whole, and really pick your brain on that. And why pick one investor over others? So like when you went down the road of looking at investors, we're going to talk about the different type of investors and why you chose the route you went, but also who and what did you look for in a profile of like why. So those are just some of the topics we're going to jump into. But let's start off with, first and foremost, why? Why raise money at all, let alone 76 million?
Yeah, it's funny. In my career, I've done a really vocal job of advocating both sides of this argument. Back in when we co-founded RJ Metrics back in 2008, we started that company on a Friday in September that year, and then on Saturday, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and we found ourselves kind of dropped into this market where like you couldn't raise money if you wanted to. Like we didn't know what we were doing, so we probably wouldn't have even been able to raise money in a hot market back then with a first company and a half-baked idea. But really spent the first 3 or 4 years of RJ Metrics, my previous company, totally bootstrapped, and frankly arguing pretty sternly that raising venture capital is a dumb thing that you should not do as a business, and that it kind of puts all this unnecessary risk on a company and forces these growth constraints that can be unrealistic. I think how my view on that has evolved. Ironically, by the way, at RJ Metrics, we ended up growing pretty fast, and uh, when the venture markets came back to life, there was a very good argument on the opposite side to raise money, and we ended up raising a seed, an A, and a B for that company before we sold it. But at Crossbeam, it's been a very different approach, and I think where my thinking has matured on this is just like there's no real reason to draw a line in the sand and say raising money is always good or raising money is always bad. I think it's a question of the personal risk profile of the founders and the level of um, basically the level of forward investment that needs to be made in order to bring a vision into reality. And I think in the early days of RJ Metrics, which was a data analytics software company, you're in an established market. There's a lot of consulting and other things you can do to generate revenue that can go right alongside the product. There was a lot of build, measure, learn, lean startup cycle kind of stuff that we could do. And it made sense as a bootstrapped business to kind of find our footing and navigate our way to product market fit. Crossbeam's a very, very different business where when we started this company in 2018, and we can talk more about this with a later question, but we got a lot of very, very funny looks when I went into the room and tried to pitch anybody on doing something in the partner technology space. The general consensus among the venture community was that PRM was pretty much it. Like that's the entirety of what existed for partnership tech, and that while there are some good pieces of technology out there, it at that time at least was a pretty sleepy space, right? A lot of the players that were there had been there for 10 or even 20 or more years. They were big but not growing fast. There hadn't seemed to have been a lot of innovation. There didn't seem to be a lot of budget. So it was kind of this contrarian view that there might be an opportunity to do something that would create a new dimension by which partner teams could leverage technology to create value. But doing that means running a playbook that is just filled with all this inherent risk and capital risk specifically, because you're running a category creation play. So this is all about, hey, this is something that does not exist today that we need to convince the world that if it did exist, we'd all be better off. And changing those hearts and minds and building out the brand and the narrative and the positioning and all the things that you name, all the little pieces of how the platform works. Like these are all things that require really meaningful investment. And then on top of that, because of the nature of what Crossbeam is, it's a network effects business. And if you don't know Crossbeam, by the way, really, you can think of us as almost like an escrow service for data. So we sit in between companies that partner with each other and allow them to compare their sales pipelines and their customer lists and honestly any data set that they want to connect to figure out where that data overlaps, but not overshare information that's not relevant to the partnership. So if you think about that business, we should have never been able to have a first customer, because if a first company signed up, they'd have nobody to partner with and share data with, and they'd get no value out of the platform. So we knew there was going to be a really, really long time where we had this classic cold start problem related to network effects, where we kind of had to like push this boulder up a hill to get enough critical mass where if any random company signed up, suddenly we could have confidence that a high number of their partners would already be on the platform. And all of these things in combination told us that it was going to be years of building and giving a lot of value away to a very large number of people before we would actually establish enough momentum and the value proposition would get strong enough that we could add more features and functionality and applications on top that we could actually turn it into a monetizable SaaS business, which is kind of where we are today. So anyway, it's a long-winded answer to your question around like why raise money or don't. I think the honest answer is it depends really heavily on the nature of the business you're building, the amount of capital risk that exists in being able to get from a point where you're starting to a point where you might be able to sort of subsist off of profitability or other funding means, and what the road in the middle looks like, and frankly, how big it gets if it all works, which is kind of another thing that can dictate how much it's worth raising and at what valuation. So anyway, I'll stop at that. But I think with Crossbeam specifically, it was a no-brainer that this was going to be a venture-backed business from day zero.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think you guys were smart in the sense of thinking about it opposite of the PRM. And I think that's the way, if you look at 10 years ago, and we'll kind of go back in time and talk a little bit about what partnerships looked like back in the day, because I think there's, with anything, there's been an evolution, and PRMs were the evolution. It was, you need a partner relationship management tool. And I struggled heavily 10 years ago trying to implement one and see success. outside of just registering leads. Co-marketing, all that stuff was a struggle. And so then you guys came in the market and made it so much easier for us to be able to say, well, great, we have a partnership. Where are our customers that we have in common? So we do case studies and made it to where I can actually accelerate a partnership relationship 10 times fast. Instead of 6 months of return on investment, I can see 3 months. And it's across not only customers, but prospects and leads and all that good stuff. So let's kind of go back in time a little bit and let's kind of set the tone and pace on what did partnerships look like 10 years ago. Obviously, we had some affiliate, we had resellers that were, if you go even further back, they were selling floppy disks with Axe software. And then we had somewhat, which would be considered a reseller, and then somewhat of a referral partner relationship. So through your experience with the different companies you had, why Crossbeam? And then 2, did it have an influence from the way the world has evolved in partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, the lens I use to look at this is actually, ironically, doesn't start with partnerships at all. It starts with data and kind of the modern data stack and the modern data landscape. And I think there were a couple of things that that got me excited about this idea. And some of them are kind of on the product side, which is where all the data stuff comes in. And some of them were observations I had on the market side, which is just kind of pattern recognition from my past companies. So like I said, my past companies, RJ Metrics and Stitch, way nerdier companies than Crossbeam. I mean, Crossbeam's pretty nerdy, but like RJ Metrics was literally like SQL queries and charts and graphs, and Stitch was even more deep down in the data infrastructure. It was basically an early Fivetran competitor, right? Like data pipelines and ETL pipelines and things like that. So with both of those businesses, the reason that Crossbeam came to mind was just because we would have been amazing customers for something like Crossbeam. Like, it's your classic entrepreneur story where it's like, I wished this thing existed for 10 years straight and kept seeing the problem over and over and over again. And then when we got acquired by Magento, I saw the problem continue to exist in that much bigger context all across that organization. And then we got acquired by Adobe and we saw it continue to exist there in like these orders of magnitude bigger companies. So that pattern recognition kind of kicked in and just said, look, there's this prisoner's dilemma problem, this data standoff problem that exists across anytime companies are trying to collaborate across company lines, where you really don't have any good options. You can either overshare your data and subject yourself to a bunch of risk, or you can not share any data and you can basically have to operate in an environment where you're not measuring success, which makes it impossible to scale. Or you can do really weird, shady, creepy stuff like emailing spreadsheets around of your customers and your leads between account execs, which is what that's what account mapping means to the vast majority of people historically. And it's and not only is it a compliance nightmare, it's actually an execution nightmare because, there's only so many VLOOKUPs you can write to try to like figure out if domain names match before you start to realize you're missing half the deals or more that you could be working on. So anyway, all that combined and kind of compounded and snowballed in my experiences at all these other companies to say, look, there's a huge market opportunity here. And there's nothing inside of PRMs have 20 different pieces of features, right? They're these amazing like bundled packages of all the stuff related to doing partnerships, but none of them had anything about data. And I found that to be kind of a head scratcher. So then when we were running Stitch, the real eye-opening moment, getting back to my point about data, was that, what we saw at Stitch was, oh, wow, the world versus 10 years ago has drastically changed in terms of how portable, extensible, and secure and reliable customer data actually is. Like, when we were writing API integrations a decade ago at RJ Metrics, they were the worst. Like trying to pull data out of NetSuite was like, let's download an 80 megabyte, XML file that defines the spec of the API and write a huge amount of custom code just to get the little nugget of data that you need. And then, by the way, 3 weeks later, the API completely changes with no notice and there's no documentation, right? And your whole thing breaks. The last decade has just the maturity of the API economy has just been really incredibly rapidly evolving to the point now where it's table stakes. Like, you can't even start a SaaS company without having these very highly available APIs that provide data in a beautiful structured format where you've got grandfathering of old endpoints if you change them and upgrade, and documentation leads the actual reality by a couple of dev cycles. It's great. And what that means is, if your data is sitting inside of a platform that's connected to the cloud, suddenly you can really reliably get that data out. And you couple that with the digital transformation revolution that's happened over the last 10 years, and even the slowest growing oldest companies have started their migration to the cloud, which means that a lot of their data, and especially revenue and go-to-market data, is now sitting in the cloud, right? So you combine those two things and you've got all of the data is in the cloud now, and all of the cloud connected systems have these amazing APIs that allow you to get the data out. And you combine those, and there's the product side of your product market fit, right? So there's this market opportunity over here that's very clearly in the partnerships realm, and there's this thing that has happened in the landscape of underlying data tools that has made it possible to build something that never existed before. And what sits in the middle of that, because everything in my world is a Venn diagram, what sits in the middle of that Venn diagram is this idea for Crossbeam, which is like, hey, what if we built this independent third-party platform that could sit in between companies that are collaborating with each other, and provide them with a means by which they could compare their data sets, have them update automatically, and then take action on them. So I think that this is all getting back to your question of like, why start Crossbeam at all? And I think the real reason to me is like it felt like there was a window opening that if we didn't go do this now, somebody else was going to do it within the next couple of years. And the why now question was really, really, really profound. And by the way, there was all this fun other stuff attached to it, like the network effects I talked about before, and like the category creation stuff I talked about before. And I love that stuff. Like that's the stuff that gets me fired up about starting companies and, trying to really build from nothing. So that's, hopefully that answers your question.
It does, and I think everybody can kind of feel and see the passion behind what you're trying to solve for, not only on the data side, which I 100% agree, but all the pain points of those of us in partnerships that are trying to generate more revenue and get more engagement from our partners. So that's awesome. Thank you. So the next question I want to ask you, I want to dive in before we dive into the types or methods of which we can go raise money. I'd love to find out, when you started opening, obviously you had raised some money before for Crossbeam, but were you surprised, and what was the response when you decided to go raise? $76 million is not a small chunk of change. I mean, it's a good amount of money. Were you surprised that, did you get an incredible response? And if yes, obviously, were you surprised by that response?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the $76 million round, there's a little bit of this like cat and mouse game that happens in later stage VC, especially in this market, where the traditional idea of like going out and running a fundraising process has kind of fallen apart or fallen by the wayside over the last year or two, as just the dynamics of the venture market have shifted a bit. At the early stages, it's still very real. Like if you want to raise a seed round, there's a good amount of pounding the pavement. You meet a lot of investors. You kind of pitch. You find somebody that's got an alignment with your vision and negotiate terms. In these later stage deals, the dynamics of the market have changed a good amount just because of the amount of capital that is out there. Non-traditional investors and hedge fund style investors and like more financial institutional investors have kind of descended on the initially it was the private equity space and then the growth equity space, and now it's the venture capital space, and some of them are going all the way down to seed rounds, and it's impacting valuations, and it's impacting the scarcity of good deals. And because of that, it's putting a lot of pressure on venture firms to actually be the ones doing the pitching. So because of that, between the time when we raised our Series B, which was the $25 million round with Redpoint that we did in the summer of 2020, between then and when we did this most recent round, what I had was much less a process of actively pitching people and much more an exercise in just relationship management across a fairly large landscape of venture investors that, we knew could potentially be interested in the space and in the tech that we're working with. So a lot of things kind of came to a head last summer where we had 2 or 3 of these firms all kind of independently wanting to dig in and go a little bit deeper. And the question on our side was less like, do we want to quote unquote go out and fundraise? And it was a little more, is this the right time for us to actually invest the time and the energy to get these firms the data that they want and the access to our customers that they want? And, really put the work into articulating our 5-year, 10-year vision for a venture capital style audience? Or is that, not something that's worth it right now? And I think what we saw happening in the business was a lot of the things that we hoped would be true kind of came true. And because of that, we felt like we could see into the future a little bit more than we had ever been able to in the past in terms of what we wanted to build, how we wanted to build it, what markets we thought were relevant, how we thought we could grow within the markets that we were in. And that's kind of what gave us the confidence to say, okay, now's the time. Getting back to your original question around like, were the markets receptive? I would say they very much so much so that they were kind of proactively trying to push the conversation. And then the dollar amount almost becomes more a function of the other inputs to the deal, right? Like these firms have funds that are of a certain size and they kind of need to put a certain amount of money to work in any given check in order for it to make logical sense. You combine that with, we only have a certain amount of appetite for dilution that we might suffer in a future round. And then as a check and balance, you couple that with what else is going on in the market, the public markets, the private markets, to make sure you don't accidentally back into a valuation that like makes zero economic sense whatsoever, which by the way, those are happening all over the place. And depending on who you ask, you would say that our round is probably one of them. But in my view, what we were able to do is it's just this optimization problem where like you pull down one lever, which is valuation, and the dilution lever goes up, right? So then you pull down the lever for how much money you raise, and then the valuation lever goes down too much. And it's just like what was nice is that we were able to find a way to configure those levers that made everybody happy. And it just so happened that it shook out that, it was the $76 million number. And frankly, that also just corresponded to, we wanted to raise enough money that if we didn't raise money again for another 5 years, it would be fine. And we could continue to go off and build this thing. And we wouldn't be beholden to this constant cycle of raising venture funds if anything happened to the market. So I think that's the way it came together.
Awesome. So before we jump into, obviously, a 2 to 3 you're kind of narrowing down to, before we jump into who and why you chose them, let's jump into the different formats of which you can actually raise money, because there's not just one way, right? There's not just the traditional or the Silicon Valley or the hybrid hedge fund. There's not bank debt and all that kind of stuff. But if you could give the audience basically a breakdown of all the different ways that you can actually go and raise money and where you might do that from the beginning to where you're a little bit more of a mature company.
Yeah. So I'll go from least dilutive to most dilutive. And when I say
Perfect.
dilutive, it just means giving up more of your ownership in your company. So if you own 100% of your company and you want to, give up as little as possible, but be funded as well as you can, this is kind of the stuff you can do in order. So the least dilutive form of capital is revenue. If you can just sell more of your stuff and operate your business profitably and have more profits, then you don't need any outside funders, and that is a incredibly powerful funding source if you can pull it together. It's hard to do, especially at the early stages, especially in technology markets where there's very often a lot of upfront investment in building that needs to happen before you can deliver value. So you get into a little bit stuck, which is why people start raising from venture firms in the early stages. But anyway, revenue, right? That's kind of number one. The next least dilutive will be different flavors of debt. And depending on the stage of your company, you may or may not be able to get access to these. Like very early stage companies, depending on your industry, you might be able to get like a small business administration loan or find ways to have like structured debt from sources, whether they're banks or funds or even nonprofits that are looking to back companies with certain founder profiles or in certain industries or things like that. Debt's great because you just pay it back and you don't necessarily get diluted. Sometimes when you raise debt from these sources, they do take what's called warrants, which is basically like giving them stock options. But usually it amounts to a much, much lower percentage of ownership in your company than if you just straight up sold stock to raise money. Then probably next in the chain would be like a special kind of debt, which is ARR financing. So there's banks like Silicon Valley Bank and Comerica have been doing this for a really long time. But there's newer startups, companies like Pipe that are out there that are doing this in a more structured way, which is basically like they look at your annual recurring revenue and they say, hey, we're pretty sure that even if everybody at your company got hit by a bus tomorrow, you'd continue to have this level of income because it's just like people on credit cards or bank wires or whatever just paying you on a recurring basis. Therefore, we'll let you borrow against that. So, you kind of put up your future ARR as collateral, and it's almost like getting paid cash in advance of that revenue stream. There's another firm out there, I think it's called Hercules Capital, that does some stuff in this arena where they'll do kind of venture style sell debt lending. But all the stuff kind of in the family of debt, it's nice if you can get it. What's tricky is you kind of need to have ARR to borrow against, or you need to have a lot of venture debt, like will never get issued unless there's already a venture firm in on the deal. And that's kind of like the criteria, which kind of defeats the purpose for a lot of folks. So, so anyway, there's a lot of stuff in that realm. And then you get into actual like equity financing, which is the venture capital stuff that I was talking about. And you just have a bunch of different categories of folks. Like your traditional venture investor will do things like take a board seat, become actively involved in the company. Usually they'll want to end up owning somewhere between 10 and 30% of your business for, putting some capital in. But hopefully they also add a whole bunch of value. And they also get all kinds of special rights, like they get their money back before you get any money, right? If you sell the company, and they have a block on large decisions like selling the company or like raising more capital or things like that. So even if they only have one board seat and you have the majority of the board, they can still block transactions. They can still they have a lot of powerful stuff. So who you end up working with ends up being very, very important there. There's also, I mentioned those hedge fund kind of style investors before. This is like the Tiger Globals and SoftBanks and Coaches of the world, where they do sometimes take board seats, but they very often won't. And because of the volume of deals that they're doing, can potentially be anywhere on the spectrum from like very activist involved investors to very, very passive capital. And the passive capital thing is nice if you want to retain operational control of the business in a big way. But if you want, the more help you want, the more hands-on you want. It's kind of a decision between traditional venture and those kind of styles of capital. And then the other thing that I'll just throw in, which is it's a category that's always been around, but it's bigger than ever now, which is just angel investors. Like in every single round that we've done, a big chunk of capital has come from just individuals out there, like operators, CEOs, founders, people that have sold their companies that, want to write a check anywhere from $10,000 to $1 million because it's part of their own personal financial strategy to invest directly in startups. And by the way, they don't take board seats. They're just like actively available to help you when you need it, but are not going to be overbearing in some way. And I've always loved that as a strategy, getting those folks around the table. And one more category, corporate VCs, right? Which we can talk more about this, but you'll notice in our last round, right, we had participation from Salesforce Ventures, HubSpot Ventures, Ring Central Ventures, Okta Ventures, a bunch of these funds where it's actually companies who are customers and or partners of ours coming on and investing dollars into our business as part of a venture financing round. And there's a bunch of strategy behind that and a bunch of pros and cons. But I'd say those are the big buckets, right? Like that's kind of where you can go to if you want to go put a round together.
Awesome. Thank you. I think it was a really effective breakdown. One thing that we were going to jump into again before we go to actually who you signed with for the 76 and why. You obviously broke down all of the different investment types, and getting to 76 million wasn't like, hey, we started the company, we're going to raise 76 million. There were multiple either investments or seed rounds that you guys went through, correct?
Oh yeah. So this is our Series C round. So just very briefly, we've basically raised money every summer since 2018. So in 2018, Buck and I co-founded the business. We had a PowerPoint deck. We hadn't written a single line of code yet, didn't have a single customer, and we raised a seed round from Uncork Capital and First Round Capital. And then in the summer of 2019, we raised our Series A from Firstmark Capital. Summer of 2020, we raised the Series B from Redpoint, and then the summer of 2021, we raised the Series C from Andreessen Horowitz. So it's been a pretty steady drumbeat on like a 12-month fundraising cadence since the founding of the company.
Awesome. Now we can jump into, you had 2 to 3, you were kind of building a relationship management, as you mentioned. Why did you go with who you went with?
Yeah, and I think, what's funny too, the 2 to 3 is maybe getting in at the funnel kind of towards the end, right? The reality is, and I have this spreadsheet somewhere. I have to make sure it not accidentally share screen. I think I'll look at this. From the Series C round, there were, so in the 1 year, right, in the summer between when we raised the Red Point round and when we did the Series C, I had interactions with 58 different venture capital firms that were kind of qualified and of scale to potentially do the Series C for us. A lot of these were initiated by cold inbound emails from those firms, but quite a few of them are, the firms that are savvy and well connected. They'll get introduced to me through my existing investors, right? So they'll network in through previous investors of the company, or there's a lot of kind of holdover relationships that I have from my past companies or from, shared board members and things like that of people in my network. So if I look at, I've got this kind of like CRM style Google sheet that I maintain on these conversations. And I have these like engagement scores of 0, 1, 2, or 3, just an indication of how much time we spent with them. And 0 is like, I got an email and I didn't reply, right? 1 is I got an email and we had some back and forth and agreed to speak at some point. 2 is we had multiple calls where we engaged in some way. 3 is they got some data, or we got on the phone and got so far as talking about like what our revenue looks like and when we might want to fundraise and kind of like the mechanics of what a round might look like. So of those 58, what I've got in this data is there's, let's see, we can go to count. So 21 of them were 0. Wow. 14 of them were 1. 9 of them were 2s, and 14 of them were 3s. And I think what happens is when really the 3s are the ones that matter, because I've spent enough time with them that if stuff starts going, they can kind of get spun up really quickly to potentially participate in a conversation about doing a round. And what happened in the summer is that we had 3 firms that were all in that 3 bucket that all within a couple of weeks of each other kind of approached us about wanting to kind of, get to stage 4, which would be like, fly out to Philly, spend some time with us, do their own research, talk to customers, do that kind of thing. And, we were able to say, okay, we think we have enough of a, like a center of gravity in that cluster. And by the way, those were like the 3 or 4 folks that we were so excited about working with, that we said, okay, we're going to kick this off and go. So then the question becomes like, how do we choose between them? Well, part of it is they have to choose us too, right? Like people there, one of the things that's kind of a trend out there in the venture world is like, there are, even in this competitive market, a lot of people that you could kind of classify as like looky-loos, right? People that are very interested for many different reasons in getting really smart on a business and what's working and what's not working and what's exciting about the space, and tapping into the minds of the operators there, but who for all intents and purposes are probably not going to invest or are going to like wait on investing. And I'd say like what you usually get, you never get a no from anybody at this stage. You just get a not now, or you get a, hey, these are the things we need to see in order to get a lot of conviction. And I think what kind of transpired over the summer was we had a bunch of folks that were kind of like in this stage where they were like, okay, we think within the next month or 2 we're going to get there. And there is this one wild X factor that I was able to throw in, which is that I was having my second kid and the due date was September 17th. And this is like July or August. And to everybody in the group, I was like, look, I'm not trying to like create a forcing function here. We don't need to raise money. This is a preempt. We'd love to spend time and get you everything you need, but we kind of need to figure this out by like September 1st, because if we don't, I think it's going to make the most sense for us to pick up these conversations in 2022. And like, we don't need the capital take. 2022 would be fine. But if you're motivated and kind of want to have this exclusive access to this moment of time where this deal might be something that's doable, let's figure it out in the next couple of weeks, or it's not going to happen. And that was so great because it just like lit a fire up under a couple of processes in parallel. And, from day one, Andreessen Horowitz was kind of like, in the back of my head secretly, like, this is the firm that we want to work with. I feel a lot of religious alignment with that firm around how good of a job they do with branding. And in a lot of ways, they're like, they're like a media company that monetizes through venture capital, right? Like they're very widely known. The work that they put into their publications and their podcasts and the army of people that they have adding value to their portfolio companies, it's very much unmatched out there. And the folks that are working to match them are kind of, doing so by working through the model, right, that Andreessen Horowitz has formed. So you look at Crossbeam, it's very similar, right? You look at the work that Sean and our content team are kind of tasked with doing from the very early days of the business. It's like, in some ways, we at least in the early days, were like a media company that monetized through software, right? Like we did way more for brand awareness and, community development and things like that than we did even before a software tool was live. So anyway, felt a great connection there. Had a couple of partners there, Sarah and Jennifer, who were just super, super sharp on our space and efficient about it. Like, they had a deck for us that kind of summarized why they were interested. And I think it was like 5 slides long. One of these other firms gave us a deck that was like 70 slides long. And like, they were both fantastic decks, but I think I got just excited about the 5 slides as I did about the 70. And I think like the efficiency and just like, here's what's going on, here's why it's exciting, this is the brass tacks, just like really, really landed well with me. And they got the opportunity to meet some other team members. They met Buck, and it was just one big happy family. So yeah, we were, in a lot of ways, it was the pieces coming together in the way that we hoped they would. And I think many, many, many things could have gone wrong or sideways in that process that would have just led to us. I don't know that we would have raised from another firm. I think what we would have done is waited at the end of the day when you look at what was on the table.
Awesome. So we talked through types of obviously debt or seed rounds and funding that you can receive. We talked through why you raised 76 million and who you are. The last thing I think I'd love to jump into for those, we've gone the entire spectrum, but one thing that I'd love to dive in a little bit deeper on is seed rounds. You mentioned, because you mentioned something that was super interesting to me. You're like, we had a PowerPoint, we had not written a single line of code, and you went out and found and got a seed round. Talk us through that process. What does that look like?
Yeah, and this is a great thing too, for the audience here, and I think for everybody in the CSA community, because there are so many partnership technology startups getting founded right now by people that used to be operators on partnership teams. It's incredible. I feel like in 2018, when we first started building, there was nothing out there. Like Bryn and the team at PartnerStack were doing awesome stuff. Kind of, they'd been around for a few years before, and I think that was like, the most interesting kind of, newer next gen innovator player out there. I've always been a big fan of the Allbound folks, and I think there's some really smart folks operating there, but it's a company that's been around for a little longer. Like, in terms of like the vintage of company, like how many partner tech companies got founded in 2017 or 2018 or 2019? The answer is 0, 0, 0, except for Crossbeam, right? It's like there was not a lot of new stuff coming out. What's happened in the last year or two is just it's been explosive. And I feel like I've seen, no exaggeration, like 20 new companies in the space kind of emerging. And they span from doing little pieces of what's in the traditional PRM stack, trying to kind of like deconstruct that, to businesses in the universe of marketplaces and marketplace enablement, to companies that are directly in Crossbeam space, kind of in the account mapping and go-to-market, to sales enablement via partner relationship, kind of co-selling motions and things like that. And it's really, really great. So anyway, the reason I preface it with that is, chances are somebody that's an attendee of this webinar is thinking about going and starting a company right now. And the first thing you're going to do is want to raise a seed round. So like, very happy to talk about that stuff. My experience on this has been so at RJ Metrics, it took us 4 years to raise our seed round. We raised a $1.2 million seed round in 2012. And we had founded that company in 2008. Like I said, in Crossbeam, we raised a seed round before we had written a single line of code. We raised it on like day 0 of founding the company. So the question is, what's the difference? And I think really what it boils down to is seed investors are looking to, they run this calculus that's kind of the balance of risk versus opportunity. And it's like, for every piece of risk that might cause this thing to fail, it's like -1 point. And for every piece of opportunity that makes it especially compelling, it's like +1 point. So on the de-risking side, we had a lot going for us because first and foremost, it's just a completely unfair advantage that I'm a repeat founder that's sold 2 companies, right? Like that is something that I never had the benefit of before, and I have the benefit of it now, and I can see like the overwhelming privilege that comes with that in fundraising. It's just like, when you talk about risk and the things that create a minus for investors, a very common minus is inexperienced founders, people that have, been exclusively operators before, or if you get somebody that's just coming out of college, graduating, or just hasn't been in an environment that feels like a growth environment, these are all major risk factors that like kind of knock some points off. We actually got plus points for that because, we were coming at it from the experience of having built and gotten to a successful exit before. The macro economy is a big thing that can be like a plus or a minus risk factor. Like, are venture firms investing actively? How competitive is the space? How much like FOMO will the venture investor feel by not getting in the deal? Like, how much excitement and hype is there kind of generally around putting capital to work at large? And I think that does have an impact on the likelihood of any given deal getting done at any given time. And then other factors are things like, what's the total addressable market? And this is where, in fundraising for our seed round, the partnership market at that time was a definite minus. Like, this is the thing that we had to navigate around. In the seed and series A of this round, we spent more time talking about a TAM, total addressable market, for generally what we wanted to do than any other topic. It was the reason that people said no. And it hasn't even come up, right, in like the last 2 rounds of funding, just because of what's gone on in the partnership space, the amount of momentum around that, the extent to which people realize that partnership is just kind of a force multiplier for sales and marketing and product, and like really the sum of the TAMs of all of those technology markets is the TAM that you should be thinking about when you think about where partner tech can actually drive ROI and create value, and therefore build value for a core company. But in the early days, right, that was a minus for us. And then there's also just execution risk, and that comes with having an experienced founder or not. But there's also like, what's the Josh Koppelman at First Round calls this founder market fit, right? Like, are the human beings that are trying to solve this problem actually, is there a reason why they are well suited to this particular task, or are they just generalist business people that think this is a hot market? And when you have somebody where there's high founder market fit, it's really high value. And then the last thing I kind of say is, like, especially for seed rounds, there's very often this why now question that ends up being really, really important. And we, like I mentioned before, with that kind of like Venn diagram of product market fit, that was our answer to the why now question. We felt like we were, if anything, a little bit early, but we thought kind of like right on time for something big that was going to be happening in and around this particular space, driven by the data revolution that was happening. And I think that, like, if you don't have a good why now answer, you don't have good founder market fit, even if you have a great idea and the potential for product market fit is there, there's a little bit of a question for VCs. It's like, why back this team on this idea, right? Like, there will be other teams working on this idea. This team could work on other ideas. Like, what's the reason for writing the check? So I think if you're going out fundraising, it really is a lot of those things I just described have a lot less to do with, like, the building, and a lot more to do with the narrative and the storytelling around, here's why we think this is going to get really, really, really big. And here's why it should be done now, and why it should be done by this team. And I think that's the story that sells in these seed rounds, especially in growth spaces where deals are competitive. So anyway, that's my like privileged repeat founder answer. The answer for a lot of folks is, a lot of firms will say, not now, go show us some progress. Go eat ramen noodles for a year and build something and get a couple customers on it and get them to say, hey, this is like an amazing thing that I can't live without, and then I'll go back you. And the science of fundraising is balancing that ask against creating a sense of urgency for the investor community to say, look, if you don't make this investment now, someone else is going to, right? And not letting them kind of like drag you along or string you along through these milestones if you know what you want to do is raise money, and you're going to need that capital.
Perfect. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to leave some time to the audience, anybody that would like to ask a question. Outside of that, before we get into questions, I just want to throw out a reminder. SAS Connect, it's coming up April 27th to the 28th. And in San Francisco, if you haven't registered, you need to. Not only myself, but I'm pretty confident that Bob is going to be there as well, among many, many other of our channel and partnership folks. And it is truly an event for us to be together, talk these kind of conversations and these kind of topics, and to help each other kind of grow and find success and drive partnerships even further. So if you haven't registered, do so. Outside of that, any questions or anything you like to additionally add, Bob?
Yeah, feel free to, there's a Q&A thing in your Zooms there if anybody wants to send a question across. We did have one question come in, which is just around what percent of your time of a CEO is spent on fundraising / investor management. I kind of put this in two buckets. Like if you look at I keep all my notes in Notion and tag everything. And I have two separate tags. One of them is fundraising and one of them is board management. So there's like, what's the time that you spend with people you have not yet raised money from? And then what's the time that you spend with the people that you have already raised money from, kind of making sure they're in the loop and maintaining those relationships. And I'd say as a percentage of time, I try to keep it well below 5% of my time, unless I'm in an active fundraising cycle. So a lot of this stuff, like I mentioned, the 59 investors, really what you start to learn as a CEO over time is that a huge amount of your job is just having the same conversation over and over again, and kind of beating the same drum and telling the same story many times. And that's certainly true in these investor kind of first intro calls. So I try to keep those calls to 20 to 30 minutes when they do happen. I only have them with folks where we've at least exchanged some kind of email that indicates to me that they would potentially be a good fit. And I understand, like, what's their fund size? What's their check size? What are some existing investments that they have? How are they connected to folks that I know and will be able to reference them through? So of that 50 some odd, I'm only on the phone maybe with 20 of them. And those 20, it's a 20 or 30-minute phone call. So call that 10 hours, right, of total time, and maybe another 5 hours of email time. So, that's 15, 16 hours. That's 2 business days of time in aggregate, spent over the course of a 1 year period, right, in between fund cycles. So 2 days over the course of 1 year. Then in the funding cycle, it gets intense. And it can kind of become like a full-time job for what spans anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, typically. At RJ Metrics, we had a Series B fundraise attempt where we kind of botched it and nobody bit, and we didn't end up raising money until like a year later. I think we spent 3 months trying to raise that Series B because we kept getting no's, and then just like, and this was a time when you had to fly to San Francisco in order to do a partner meeting. There was no such thing as Zoom, and we were based in Philly. So my co-founder Jake and I would like fly out on the first flight out Monday morning, land at leave Philly at 6 a.m. Eastern, which is 3 a.m. Pacific time, land at 9 a.m. in SFO, go out to Sand Hill Road and do a partner meeting at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. And then like have lunch and get on the red eye and be back in Philly, at 6 a.m. the next morning. We did that like weekend after weekend after weekend for like a month or two there. And it put some real miles on my emotional age. But anyway, all that to say, it can vary greatly, but I think if you are really good at task management and minimizing switching cost and like bundling the same type of work together to like knock it out in sequence and using the same work repeatedly in multiple contexts and conversations, you can really get these numbers down. And I'd say for raising our Series C, this round that we did, it was probably, in aggregate 2 to 3 days of relationship management work over the course of the year, and then probably 2 to 3 weeks of like really intense due diligence style work to get the term sheet signed.
Awesome. Another question from Simon. How do you talk about the TAM for Crossbeam?
Oh yeah, this is a great question. So in the early days, this is one of those things where when no one has done the work to define your TAM, you have two options. You can be kind of vague and hand wavy and not quite give an answer, which is very unsatisfying for investors, and also leaves them to go do their own work, which at a seed stage you probably never want to have done because you're losing control of your narrative at that point. Or you can come up with your own answer and try to make it something that's not hand wavy, but that is actually the result of some kind of analysis you've done. And one thing for Crossbeam that we did, a lot of people know that we have this website. It's called partnerbase.com. And you can think of it almost as like Crunchbase for partnerships. So this is totally separate from Crossbeam. No Crossbeam data gets into it at all. It's like this totally independent data set. And what partnerbase.com is, it's just a giant data set where we have had a small team doing research over the last 3.5 years, basically building up a giant graph database of all of the partners and partnerships that exist out there in the world. So there's 80,000 companies, I think, represented in partner base, and 250,000 some odd partnerships. And what that does is provides us with a little bit of a view into, hey, if Crossbeam is successful, this is what our network graph of companies will look like, right? We've got almost 6,500 companies on Crossbeam today. There's 80,000 companies on that graph and growing. It goes to say, like, hey, we've barely scratched the surface. We have less than 10% of the potential addressable market has even signed up for Crossbeam, let alone become a paying customer, let alone partner base even being anything close to complete. So what we did to talk about the TAM for Crossbeam was we pointed to partner-based data, and we actually started like writing blog posts and other kind of speculations on the partnership market and what's exciting about it, using that partner-based data as like an input. And I think that provided us with some kind of like ability to speak with authority on the fact that we thought really, really hard about this problem. And that's the total addressable market is a dollar number, right? And partner base is a number of companies. So then the question just becomes like, okay, within these companies, what do you think the potential revenue the average company can be? And within that, like, why? And what I mentioned earlier, I think holds very true and is a core part of our TAM discussion, which is like, we are, as a business, not just a partnership technology company. We're a data platform. Like the Crossbeam network, what we achieve by building it is that we unlock this data layer that has never existed before, which is basically the sum of all the centers of the Venn diagram. So it's this, we become the one exclusive place you can go to get the answer to, hey, where does my data set collide with another company's data set? And you cannot do this without partners become the ultimate champions of all this, and partner managers become these superheroes that are the glue that holds this network graph together. But once you have the data, you're not just selling to partnership professionals. The ripple effects of where this data can go has a place in sales enablement, marketing enablement, in products, in corporate development and mergers and acquisitions, all the way into engineering organizations and kind of the optimization of building and delivering products in the first place. It's this contextualized knowledge that you could argue is as valuable as any data set that might exist in a data warehouse. So, look at the market cap of Salesforce, look at the market cap of Snowflake, these companies that have become clear first place leaders and therefore been able to build their own ecosystems around the data that they have exclusively in their platform. And I think where we position ourselves from a TAM standpoint is as being a peer to those calibers of companies when our vision gets fully realized. And you start to talk about that and you're talking about $100 billion market caps, and it's not hard for VCs to get excited about where the company can go.
Awesome. We'll do one more question because we still have some time. So might as well take advantage of it. And we'll finish it off with Justin's question is, what's your point of view on the future of SaaS partnerships?
Yeah, I have a lot of point of views there. I think SaaS partnerships specifically are very, very exciting to me because and look, this is going to be a very self-serving answer, right? It's hard. The things we're building at Crossbeam are very directly aligned with this vision. But I think when you rewind the clock to a pre-SaaS era, or even in the early days of SaaS and SaaS delivery, partnerships meant channel partnerships. Like that's what partnerships were. And yes, there were these like ISV quasi partnerships that existed out there, but in the era before APIs or at least maturity of APIs, they were very often more like strategic in nature, or you'd literally be like developing a product on somebody's operating system or something, not just like integrating data. What's happened over the last decade, and more specifically over the last 3 to 5 years, is that because of that API maturity, SaaS partnerships have ended up kind of escalating ISV partners to being these first-class citizens that have a seat at the table in a lot of companies, even more so than the channel partnerships, or at least before chronologically the channel partnerships come into play. And companies will come out of the gate building tech integrations and having ISV partners, but they might not start building out a channel org until they have, $10 or $20 million of revenue many, many years into their growth. So that evolution then starts to beg the question, well, these ISV partnerships, if they're the core germ of the partnership is a product integration or data flowing between products, that's very much a product initiative. But there is this amazing corollary to that relationship that exists in the go-to-market revenue side of the house, where those ISV relationships can actually be a lever by which customer accounts grow more rapidly, sales deals close faster, new leads are originated with higher quality and at a higher rate, initial ACVs are higher because of greater value creation and greater adoption of extensible features in the software. And I think what we're seeing is that really come to life, and solutions like Crossbeam are fit right in the middle of that, because it's really allowing people to take what feels like these SaaS product integration ISV partnerships, which are very much like a product thing, and actually make them look and feel and behave just like channel partnerships used to. Like tech partnerships are the new channel partnerships, where that dividing line, where we even see this in org charts, right? Like it used to be that like the channel people are in the revenue org and the tech partner people are in the product org, and it's two completely different, like siloed operations, and that's going away. We're seeing more and more of these integrated partnership organizations sitting under chief partnership officers, or just sitting in one side or the other of that org chart, where the difference between channel and ISV partners, while there are nuances in the execution and the nature of how the deals flow, the thing they have in common is that they are ROI positive, revenue driving, relationship based interactions with external parties. And that commonality means that the skill sets and the technology and the best practices involved can be very, very common across those different types of things. So then the future of SaaS partnerships, to get to the question, right, is like, this convergence, this bundling of all these different categories of partnerships into this one centralized track of, what are the relationships we have external to our business that are going to drive the growth of our business in a material, measurable way. And what you're going to see in the coming years, hopefully, at least somewhat driven and accelerated by things we're coming out with Crossbeam, is far greater attribution available and the measurement of the impact of these things that are happening at all these different pieces of the customer life cycle and the conversion funnel, and the ability to kind of take that and be able to detect where energy ought to be being spent, right? And which deal you ought to be working on next with which partner, and then how much value actually got created because of the relationship in that partner in that deal. And you start to get really, really good at that. And then, partnerships themselves become that same first-class citizen sitting right alongside sales and marketing and other folks inside the org. And that's kind of the holy grail that we started with as a belief system for our company. So lots to come there. I think we're in the early innings of all this stuff still.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate you taking the time. I think you definitely provided everybody with a massive amount of knowledge and data dump. Data is your thing, right? So it makes sense. But thank you again for coming on and sharing all your knowledge and expertise and a little bit about Crossbeam.